So hello everyone, this is Ryan Shaw with Campus Clarity. Thank you for joining us on the webinar today, How to Address Hazing Culture on Campus. With me today we have Dr. Gentry McCreary, who I will introduce here in just a moment. Also we have Pax Haymeyer, who will be moderating the event. We're just going to give one more minute here so everyone's going to have a chance to join. We will be respectful to the hard stop time at 11:45 Pacific time, 2:45 Eastern. In advance of the start time, I want to mention we will be recording the event. For those who might be interested in sharing this webinar with their colleagues, give us about a week here. We'll get that out to you. It's very busy for us around here, as you can imagine. So we'll have this recording ready by the end of next week. We will also be live tweeting the event. You can follow us at the Twitter you see on the screen there, #PreventHazing, and you can see the handle up on the slide. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about the structure of the event. We have set aside about 45 minutes. I will go ahead and run through the introductions of Dr. Gentry McCreary and Pax Haymeyer. The platform is going to be a 30-minute question-driven format, and what that means is we have about 10 to 12 questions that relate to the core topic that Dr. McCreary will be discussing. We of course welcome your questions as well, and you can go ahead and enter those into the chat box, and we will either take a moment during the presentation to address those, or we certainly will have time at the end to address as many as we can. Because we're expecting to have over 130 people on the call, we may not have time to address all the questions, but be sure to go ahead and submit them anyways, and we'll try to get them as quickly as possible via email to you. So the presentation will run about 30 minutes, and we'll give 15 minutes for a Q&A, and then a hard stop time at 11:45. We want to be respectful to that. And then we will go into an optional presentation by George Homer, of our Think About It course, and many of our clients are on this webinar today, so that may be not as relevant to you. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote today, Dr. Gentry McCreary. Dr. McCreary is the CEO of Dyad Strategies and a leading expert on hazing within fraternities and sororities. Gentry's primary work experience has been in the areas of fraternity and sorority advising and student conduct. His award-winning research examines the psychology of hazing, the moral development of college students, and the roots of fraternal brotherhood and sisterhood. Gentry currently serves on the board of directors for both the Association of Fraternity Sorority Advisors and the Center for the Study of College Fraternity. Gentry is also affiliated with the consultant with National Center for Higher Education Risk Management, where he works with college campuses on hazing prevention, investigation, adjudication, and education and training related to Title IX. Thank you for joining us, Dr. McCreary.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
I would also like to introduce Pax Haymeyer. Pax is an instructional writer here at Law Room Campus Clarity. He works closely with fraternity, faculty, staff, and students at colleges and universities all across the nation. He's developed training solutions for higher education. He has a PhD in English literature from UC Santa Barbara, and he has taught extensively at community colleges and universities. So with that, let's turn the mic over to Pax, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Great. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you for being here, Dr. McCreary. So I'd like to just start with, at the high level, talking about hazing. It might be useful to start with a simple definition. So how would you define hazing?
Yeah, there's a lot of definitions out there, and certainly different people define it in different ways. I like the definition that the 2008 University of Maine study used, which is generally any activity required of someone who's joining an organization that involves any sort of dangerous, demeaning, or humiliating activities. And I think the important clause in their definition is regardless of one's willingness to participate. Just because a freshman or a new member or a new team member, a pledge, whatever, happens to go along with what's going on and does so voluntarily doesn't make it not hazing. I think if you look at different groups will define hazing in different ways, and there's actually a study by a good friend of mine, Chad Ellsworth, who looked at this and found that, for example, fraternities and sororities may clearly define physical activities, calisthenics, etc., as hazing, whereas an ROTC unit or sports team may not, because that's central to part of what they do.
Interesting.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so who is affected by hazing? Is it just pledges? Is it broader than that?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Who is affected by hazing? Is it just the pledges? Is it just fraternity members, or?
Absolutely. Yeah. Most people only think of the victims of hazing being the ones affected, the freshmen or the new members. But there's an effect for everyone that's involved. There's some really neat comparisons that we can draw between hazing and bullying, and there's some research on bullying that shows that there's long-term negative effects for what they describe as the bully victims. That is, those individuals who have both been subjected to bullying and then turn around and bully and serve as perpetrators. And hazing plays out very much that way, in that those who are hazed as freshmen are the most likely to then turn around and be hazers once they are in a position to do so. And so there's a lot of negatives associated with that, and a fascinating study that, again, looked at the bullying component: anger, long-term feelings of withdrawal, ruminating on grievances, higher levels of moral disengagement. And a study that looked at hazing out of Radford University really talked about this very dangerous cycle in which students who are hazed are much more likely to then turn around and be hazers. So perpetration leads to victimization. And so not only are there potential physical and psychological consequences for the students who are being hazed, but there's also potentially consequences, severe long-term consequences for those who are hazed and then turn around and engage and perpetrate the activity on the back end.
That's very interesting. And so, usually when we hear about hazing, we hear about it on college or university campuses. When does hazing usually start? Is that an accurate perception, or does it start earlier?
Yeah, it's a very inaccurate perception, and I think the most illuminating thing that came from the national study of student hazing, and again, that's the 2008 study out of the University of Maine, is that over half the students that they talked to in a large national study, students who were involved in organizations on college campuses, over half of them reported experiencing hazing before they got to college, in high school, sports teams, a variety of other high school activities, cheerleaders, and I do a daily Google News alert for hazing. So any sort of article that pops up in the news that's related to hazing, I get in my inbox every day. My guess is that over half of those deal with hazing not at the college or university level, but at the high school level, and those have been really well documented over the last few years. I think a lot of people are very familiar with the Sayreville, New Jersey football team hazing. It starts happening at very young ages, and I think that's a problem, that within K-12 in particular, we're starting to do a pretty good job of addressing bullying. Hazing is very different from bullying in that way, and I don't know that the K-12 environment is doing enough to really address hazing at that level, because oftentimes we see coaches, advisors, team sponsors, etc., complicit with the activities that are going on. So certainly we need to do a much better job of educating, particularly in our high schools, coaches with athletics teams, bands, etc., that hazing is dangerous. And a study that I did for a campus, actually a fascinating finding, we found that the fraternities on this particular campus who had the highest levels of hazing were those that had the most students who reported having been involved in sports in high school. And so they were bringing with them those habits from high school, and because of that, we're seeing some even more severe hazing once alcohol was introduced, once the autonomy of a fraternity was introduced, and not having to be under the strict supervision of a coach or an advisor. So certainly the hazing that one experiences before they get to college is problematic, in that it may predict the sorts of things they'll tolerate and be part of once they're particularly in a fraternity.
That's very interesting. So just a quick, we got a question, Dr. McCurry. A few people are having a little bit of difficulty hearing you. If you could just make sure you're talking closer to the microphone or phone. We want to make sure everyone hears everything. So you mentioned, you just mentioned athletes. We of course talk about fraternities, and when we see these kinds of news stories in the media, we often hear about Greek organizations, we often hear about athletes, but what other campus organizations are affected by hazing?
Yeah, I think lots of other organizations are affected. The thing that I always tell people to look at, and it's going to differ on every campus, what are those groups on your campus that really enjoy high levels of social status? There's some status associated with being a part of that group. There's some privileges associated with being part of that group. Those are the groups that are your most likely suspects, because when there are privileges associated with being part of a group, the existing members want to protect those privileges, and they don't want to just give them away excuse me, to anyone who comes along. And so, a great example of that is the marching band just down the road from me. I'm here in Pensacola, Florida. Folks are familiar with what happened at Florida A&M University and their marching band a few years ago. If you know anything about the Marching 100 at Florida A&M, you know that they are a very high status group on that campus. It's a big deal to be part of that band. People come to football games, less so to see the football team and more to see the band perform at halftime. And so that was a high status group that was engaged in some really high risk activity. So on your campus, it may be the lacrosse team or the rugby team, whether those are varsity or club sports teams. It could be fraternities, it could be theater troops, it could be any sort of student organization. There have even been reports of hazing within student government associations, honor societies, groups where you really wouldn't expect to see that sort of thing. So knowing kind of who is where in the social pecking order on your campus can give you a really good list of possible suspects for problematic hazing within your campus.
Interesting. So you mentioned there are protecting privileges. High status groups use hazing to some extent to protect the privileges that go along with joining that group. So more broadly, why do organizations haze? Are there different reasons, and do those different reasons matter?
That's a really important question, and it aligns very closely with the research that I'm doing. Aldo Cimino, who is a researcher at the University of California, Santa Barbara, has looked at hazing through a really unique lens. He's looked at it through the lens of an evolutionary psychologist and that of an anthropologist, and has looked at hazing over time throughout various societies, and has argued, I think pretty effectively, that hazing is something that as humans we have evolved to do for that particular reason, that there's benefits associated with being in groups. Once we are part of those groups, we have high expectations for new members of those groups. And he found very clearly in his study, in a cool experimental design, that as the perceptions of the benefits associated with being in the group went up, so did people's attitudes about the appropriate levels of hazing for joining that group. So it was a really fascinating study. He's also suggested a couple of other things that my research partner Josh Schutz and I have looked at in trying to find out, can we measure different reasons that groups haze? And to quickly summarize that research, we found that the answer to that is yes. We've been able to uniquely measure 4 reasons that groups haze. One of those is this idea of building solidarity, so the unity, the solidarity of the new members. You hear that a lot in fraternities in particular. Ask a fraternity president or new member educator what the most important outcome of their new member program is. The answer you're most likely to get is, well, to have a bonded and unified pledge class. Hazing, certainly, at least in the short term, can accomplish that. The other one that we've been able to measure is loyalty and commitment. So that idea that that which we have earned too cheaply, we esteem too lightly, that in order to really appreciate something, you have to go through this tough experience in order to get it. And so some hazing is designed to put people through that hard experience so that they will really appreciate and value their membership in the organization. The third one that we found is what we call instrumental education. If there's an altruistic form of hazing, that would be it. It's hazing that's designed teach lessons about the organization or to reinforce positive things. So the example would be, the new members of the team didn't perform well, so we're going to have them do push-ups. Or the fraternity pledges were disrespectful at a party, so we're going to have them clean up the house at the party. So it's hazing still, but it's designed to reinforce some positive thing or to teach people about the values of the organization. The last one that we found, and the one that's the most problematic and the one that we're seeing more and more of, I would say this type of hazing is on the rise, is what we call social dominance hazing. And it's that hazing that really serves no purpose other than reinforcing the social hierarchy within the organization. So I'm a senior, you're a freshman, I have the power to make you do things, and so I'm going to do that. And it doesn't serve any point or purpose, in terms of building loyalty or building solidarity. It's just I haze because I can. We're seeing an increase in that, and as we've correlated that data with other organizational variables like alcohol use, the severity of hazing, moral disengagement, what we see is that students who support and measure high in social dominance hazing are more likely to support severe forms of hazing, are more likely to disengage from their moral selves and do other unethical things on behalf of the organization, are more problematic binge drinkers. And so what that has illuminated for me, and I think this is an important point, when we adjudicate and address these cases on campus, we often just focus on what, right? The what happened, what were the activities, what was going on. This research would suggest that the why is just as important as what, because if organizations are hazing for that social dominance reason, and we just haze our freshmen because we can, that's a really sick culture that is hard to change, whereas if it's instrumental education or loyalty, there are ways that activity can be redirected in more positive ways. There are ways to teach lessons to new members that don't involve hazing. There are ways to build loyalty and commitment that don't involve hazing. So if I know why a group is hazing, I can redirect that behavior. But if the why is, well, we just haze because we can, that's a really sick culture, and that's a group that I'm going to think long and hard about whether or not they need to remain a member of our campus community. So understanding why is very important, and absolutely there are different reasons why groups haze, and it's important to understand that.
That's very interesting. I want to come back to the discussing a little bit about the why towards the end of the webinar, but I wanted to sort of follow up on what we've been talking about here a little bit too. And so, sometimes after an incident, what we read in the media is that it's the result of a few bad apples. And I wanted to know what your assessment of, what your thought of that assessment of the problem was. Is it just bad apples, or is it something different?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question that a lot of social psychologists have wrestled with. I'm a big fan of Phil Zimbardo's work. If you're not familiar with
I'm sorry to interrupt. We can everyone still hear us, or is there? We just got someone who chatted us who said that they have lost sound. If you very little sound, we can hear. So we're coming in and out. So we'll just make sure. I think there might be something with a few of the connections regarding the webinar. So we'll just make sure to speak as closely as we can to the microphone, and just let us know if the sound comes out at any moment. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dr. McCurry. Just want to make sure everyone can hear what you're saying. So to repeat the question, what role does the broader campus culture play? I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. What do you think of the assessment that hazing is only the result of a few bad apples? I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, not at all. And as I was saying, that's a question that social psychologists have grappled with for quite some time. Most famously, Phil Zimbardo's work with the Stanford prison experiment, where he wondered if the result of what happened there was of a few bad apples, or if it was a bad barrel, a bad environment, a bad context, which caused people to act out in bad ways. And his thesis was that it is not a result of bad apples. And his research was actually a big inspiration for my doctoral dissertation, because my thought going into that was that these students who engage in hazing aren't any worse than the average student walking down the street, but they're thrust into an environment, they're given power that they didn't have before, and in this novel setting, they engage in behaviors that they wouldn't otherwise engage in. And I think that's true, and my dissertation found that the culture of the campus And I think there's a lot of variables within the campus culture that we've still got to understand in terms of the impact that they have. But the stronger the hazing culture on a campus, the stronger the relationship between moral disengagement. That is that notion of one's ability to kind of turn their morals on and off like a light switch, and their propensity to haze. And so this idea that it's just about bad apples is simply not true. The environment triggers this sense of, well, I can do this, I can get away with this, this is okay. And so people engage in activity that they wouldn't normally engage in. Otherwise, good students who were good before they came to college and will probably go out and be good, contributing, productive members of society, engage in some really messed up things. And I always illustrate this when I talk to students about hazing, because this is the most common excuse I get. I will ask fraternity presidents or new member educators what their greatest fear is as it relates to hazing. The most common answer I get to that question is just that I'm afraid of some bad apple, or I'm afraid of some rogue member. I can't control everyone, and I'm afraid someone's going to do something to a pledge when I'm not there and can't do anything about it. And anytime I get that response, and it's every time I ask the question, I'll engage in an activity. I'll ask everyone there, I'll say, close your eyes, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to picture in your head the person on your team, in your chapter, in your organization who's most likely to get carried away and do something, cross a line, do something they shouldn't do with a pledge. And I'll give them 2 or 3 seconds, and I'll say, okay, go ahead and raise your hand if you've already pictured someone. And every hand in the room goes up. And the reason I do that is to illustrate, if you already know who your bad apples are, then you need to address them before you put them in a position to do problematic things. We can't call them, rogue members or bad apples and chalk it up as an isolated incident when we already know who those people are. And so I think we've got to do a better job encouraging, fraternities, sports teams, other groups that are engaged in some of these activities to go ahead and address those rogue members, those bad apples, before they become problematic. So I don't think it's about bad apples, because, yeah, there are bad apples out there, but we know who they are. But good students who are not people that I would categorize as bad apples still engage in this activity from time to time.
Interesting. You already addressed my next question to some extent, but I thought if maybe you could elaborate a little bit about the role that the broader campus community can play in encouraging or discouraging hazing. So you talked a little bit about the broader culture in terms of a fraternity or an organization, an athletic organization, any kind of organization. But again, what is the broader role that the whole campus might play?
Absolutely. And I'll go through just a couple of points here that I want to make quickly. When I worked in fraternity and sorority advising, I had a rule, and that rule was if you've not said it in the last 3 months, you've never said it. So campuses can't just talk about hazing once a year during National Hazing Prevention Week, bring in a speaker once a year in kind of an anti-hazing program and expect that to be an adequate message to address this issue. We need to be talking about it all the time in as many places as we can. We need to be talking to new members before they join the groups. We need to be talking to existing members. We need to be providing training to coaches and advisors, et cetera. So I think we've got to make a commitment as institutions to talking about this more than just once a year. The other thing I think that's really important is that we've got to do a better job addressing all of the hazing that we see. I like to think about hazing on kind of this 1 to 10 continuum, where level 1 is kind of that, the little silly stuff that we don't mind so much, dressing up in a silly outfit or running errands, all the way up to level 10 hazing, which would be, kind of your extreme physical abuse, forced alcohol consumption, that sort of thing. Most campuses have an unspoken place on that continuum where they draw the line. And as long as you don't cross that line, then you're okay. So, yeah, don't hit your pledges, don't deprive them of sleep. But, yeah, you can have them dress up in a silly outfit, or, yeah, you can have them, dress all the certain way, or you can make them sit together at football games and et cetera. There's all these little things that we kind of tolerate. The problem with that approach is that it's hard to draw that line at some arbitrary place on that scale and not expect that students are going to cross that line. So we can't tolerate hazing up to level 4 and not expect that students aren't going to cross right over and engage in level 5, then level 6, then level 7. we can't tolerate any hazing. And I'm not suggesting that we become draconian and close every single organization that engages even in the slightest form of hazing, but we have to address it all. And I'll share a story that I think illustrates that well. I was on campus one day, and I was eating in the cafeteria, and I heard this commotion behind me, and I turned around, and I saw a group of what was obviously fraternity pledges. They had the telltale khaki pants and navy blazers on, and by the color of their ties, I knew what fraternity they were in, and they were standing up reciting what I assumed to be the creed of their fraternity before they sat down and ate their meal. And I noticed sitting around this long table, there were several other people kind of in plain clothes who weren't standing up and saying the creed. And I said, man, you know, not a big deal, but I need to do something. I can't be a hypocrite. I got to walk over here. So I walk over there, and they're finishing the creed. And I say, hey guys, what was that? That was kind of neat. And one of the pledges said, oh, that's our creed. We stand up and we say that, before we eat. I said, oh, that's really neat. And then I looked at one of the guys who was not standing reciting the creed and who was dressed not in khaki pants and a blazer, but in shorts and a T-shirt. And I said, well, are you not in the same fraternity? Why you didn't stand up and say the creed? Why didn't you stand up and say the creed? And his answer was priceless. He looked at me and said, well, because they're pledges. And I was like, well, hi, my name's Dr. McCrary. I'm the Associate Dean of Students. It's nice to meet you. And that was a neat opportunity to have a conversation. I was able to call that chapter president in, have a follow-up conversation with him. We didn't sanction the chapter. We didn't throw the book at them. Having the pledges stand up publicly and recite the creed. Hazing, yes, something I'm going to stay awake at night about. Not at all. But it provided an opportunity to have a conversation, and it provided us with an opportunity to address that behavior. And I was told that the next time they were all sitting together, that both the pledges and the active members stood up and said the pledge, the creed in the cafeteria. So I think that's important. I think campuses have to be careful about getting into the pick your battles games when it comes to hazing. You've got to address it on every level. You can't draw arbitrary lines and kind of ignore low-level stuff, because that low-level stuff will very quickly turn into higher level stuff. So we've got to address it anytime we see it.
That's very interesting. I just want to remind everyone who's on the webinar, if they have any questions for Dr. McCrary, to please send them to us, and we can. He's been kind enough to say he'll answer any questions that come through. And we'll get to, if we don't get to them during the presentation, we'll have an opportunity to follow up afterwards. So what you just mentioned was, an incident where you actually witnessed the hazing or firsthand, and you had an opportunity to intervene. But one of the things that has bothered me is to learn from the research that, like other issues on campus, a lot of people don't report hazing when they experience it. And so I just wanted to ask you, why don't people report hazing when they experience it, especially, the more severe kind?
Absolutely. There's such an intense pressure to belong, and, everything we know about conformity and obedience to authority, I think, Ash's conformity study, Milgram's studies on obedience to authority are very illuminating, when we think about the answer to that question. When I meet with presidents, chapter presidents, new member educators of fraternities, they will almost always say to me, well, I say to the pledges, if anyone asks you to do anything that makes you uncomfortable, or anyone tries to make you do anything that you don't want to do, come talk to me about it. And I think a lot of well-intentioned fraternity leaders say that, and when they do, I always ask them, well, how many of your pledges have actually come to talk to you about it? And the answer is always zero, because we can't put the people who are being subjected to the hazing in the position of deciding what's appropriate and what isn't. So we can't allow the pledges to be the ones calling balls and strikes. We can't allow the freshmen to be the ones who decide what's appropriate and what's not, because all they want to do is belong. All they want to do is make it through, and they may have a real problem with something that's going on, but they look around and no one else seems to have a problem with it, and so the likelihood of them saying something is really, really small. So chapters have to do a much better job of not asking their new members to decide what's right and wrong, but in clearly communicating to their chapter members what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and then to let their organization or their team see that there are consequences for people who cross that line. So it can't just be, well, if a pledge complains, then we're not going to do it. There have to be very clear expectations at the organizational level about what's acceptable and what isn't. because, again, everything we know about the pressure to belong, conformity, obedience to authority, the pledges who are engaged in this behavior, they assume that the person who's hazing them has their best interests at heart, doesn't really want to hurt them. We can't put them in the position of having to decide, well, yeah, I need to report this. We need the organizational leaders to do a better job setting clear expectations and holding people accountable to those expectations.
So, interesting, you were already getting into some of these issues around prevention, and we got a few questions that came in around sort of best approaches to prevention and intervention. So maybe if you're okay with it, I'd like to bring a few of those questions in. So
absolutely.
One participant is asking about the way we talked about the issue as a culture issue and not a bad apple issue. So how do you address that at a campus with a really deeply ingrained sense of history and tradition and pervasive Greek-like system that dominates the social scene? So how do you start initiating that culture change in a very change-averse student body?
Yeah, it represents one of our greatest challenges, but I also think one of the biggest opportunities in terms of how we can change the way we address hazing behavior. On campuses in particular where there's a really strong hazing culture, we still, even on those campuses where we know it's across the board an issue, we still have a tendency of treating hazing as if it happens in a vacuum, right? So an organization gets called hazing, and we discipline that organization. And maybe we even close that organization down for a few years, and that organization comes back in a few years, and maybe out of the gate, they're really, really strong. The national fraternity comes in, and they recruit the right guys, and for a year or two, they're doing really well, and they're not hazing, and they're really high achieving. But eventually there's this regression to the mean that happens wherein they look around them, they see what other groups are doing. There's this pressure to kind of go along and be like everyone else and not be an outlier. And over time, those organizations that are closed and come back and try to change, within a few years are right back to what they were doing before, because the culture around them is so problematic. And what I have suggested before, actually you blogged about this earlier in the year, I think a great alternative to the treated in a vacuum approach would be if and we'll talk about this through the fraternity concept because it's easier to discuss that way. What if every year the executive directors of all the fraternities got together and they conducted a poll and they said, what are the universities, the colleges out there that give us the most headaches when it comes to hazing? What are those cultures that we know are just sick, that we know there's hazing? And so they all vote on 10 campuses, and then we pick out of that the ones that are come up and voted on the most, and that each of those campuses undergoes with the national organizations working in partnership with the universities an immediate across-the-board culture change. So the national organizations commit to coming in and doing membership reviews, removing bad apples, committing to changing the culture within the organization. At the same time, the university commits to broader education, increased support, more advising, training for advisors, training for new member educators, more resources in order to help the chapters do well across the board, across the campus. That's how you change a culture. You can't change a hazing culture one chapter at a time. We've got to have a comprehensive approach. We've got to think differently about the way we're doing this, because just this chapter at a time, isolated approach isn't working. So if you feel like you're on one of those campuses where it is a bigger problem, what I would encourage you to do is to get all the fraternity and sorority executive directors on your campus as soon as you can and have that conversation and begin talking about how can we all work on this within each organization and kind of umbrella on the campus together, because that isolated chapter by chapter approach is doing very little, if anything, to change the overarching culture.
So as a follow-up to what you were saying, is we had another question: how do you get broader stakeholder engagement in the issue so that on a campus it's not just seen as the responsibility of, say, the fraternity advisor or the sorority advisor? How can you encourage and get that broader stakeholder buy-in?
Yeah, the campuses that have done this well have enlisted their senior administration, and what they have done is created campus-wide hazing prevention, task force, coalition, call it what you want, but it involves stakeholders from all those key areas that I talked about before. So your athletics department, your fraternities and sororities, your bands and other theatrical and performing arts groups, club sports, any of those usual suspects, in addition to other stakeholders like campus law enforcement, your alcohol and other drugs, sexual assault prevention people. There are prevention experts on campus that are very rarely utilized when it comes to hazing prevention, but some of the principles still apply. So I think getting senior level buy-in and then getting everyone at the table, both within the campus and again, if you're dealing with external entities like fraternities and sororities that have national headquarters, getting those people involved in that conversation as well. So I think you've got to do a good job assessing your culture. I think you should be doing climate studies to look at the hazing culture on your campus and then using that data to go to the senior level administration and say, look, we've got a problem. We've had X number of cases, X percentage of students report having experienced these things, and it's not just fraternities and sororities, and we need a broader campus-wide approach to this issue. So go to your vice president of student affairs, go to your provost, go to whoever you need to go to, and be able to present them a compelling case as to the true scope and nature of the problem on your campus. And if you can do that, they've got the ability to get people beyond just the fraternity and sorority advisor to be part of that conversation.
Another good question that came up, and I think this relates to something that you were going to talk about, and so maybe we can combine them, but one of the participants brought up the concern that through a zero tolerance or a real sort of crackdown on these issues is that you might drive some of this behavior off campus and underground, where it's not as easily, I guess, regulated or observed. And
right.
I wonder if you have any questions about that. Is that a catch-22, or is there some way to prevent that from happening?
Absolutely. There are some good ways to prevent that from happening, and there's some campuses that are actually doing a really good job of this. And again, we've got to address it at all levels, but I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that we become draconian, zero tolerance, crackdown, kick everyone off campus, because that will exactly have the impact of driving it underground, driving it off campus, and building ill will. When I was at the University of Alabama, we instituted and really pushed and publicized a self-reporting process wherein if a hazing incident happened, and it was something that it was a few members kind of isolated, not a chapter-wide condoned thing, if the organization came to us and reported what had happened, we would work with them to address just the individuals involved. We would not pursue a broader investigation against the chapter, wouldn't pursue any broader sanctions against the chapter, and would work with them just to address individuals. It took us a couple of years to build up the trust, but once chapters started doing it and seeing the benefit of it, it produced some really helpful results, and you saw groups start to move that line of acceptable behavior from more severe forms of hazing to less severe forms of hazing. I think another campus that does a really good job of this is Louisiana State University, LSU. They have, in the last few years, developed what they call a partnership process, wherein if they receive a report of hazing, they actually give the organization the first opportunity to investigate and address it internally. And they have some controls in that process, and they exert some oversight. But what they have created is an environment wherein there is trust, and that organizations know, hey, if we work with the university and partner with them to address this issue, then they're not going to crack down on us. They're going to allow us to take care of our own problems, foster that sense of self-governance, and allow us to manage ourselves. And so, in both of those instances, we were able to decrease the severity of hazing, that chapters took more ownership in addressing hazing within their organizations, and we were addressing it at all levels, but we weren't pushing it further underground. We were actually bringing it more out in the open. So I think there are certainly tactics like that. Again, I strongly recommend self-reporting provisions, a partnership process, and if you go to LSU's Greek Life or Student Conduct website, you can find a link to their organizational conduct page and kind of how that works. I think it provides us with a really cool model that a lot of other campuses, I think, would be wise to implement.
I want to just one thing that you were going to talk about, that we've talked about, and something that you've written about that I find really interesting and I think is a nice follow-up to what you've been talking about, is that you've written about the intersection of hazing and Title IX, as well as the need for campuses to use a civil rights-based model for adjudicating hazing cases. Could you talk to us about that a little bit?
Absolutely. There's some amazing intersections, and we're seeing more and more of this. The great example, a lot of people followed in the news last year, the hazing that came to light in the marching band at Ohio State University. I'm very good friends with the Title IX coordinator there. We actually presented on this topic at a conference earlier this year where we talked about the intersection of Title IX and hazing. So within the band at Ohio State, it was hazing, but it was very sexual in nature and also constituted a Title IX case. And so do you address that through your hazing organizational conduct procedures, or do you address that through your Title IX process, which is better, which is worse? And our answer to that is, well, those really should be one and the same. 20% of the hazing that's being reported now, and again, this is from the 2008 study, my guess is that these numbers have gone up. 20% of students reported hazing that involves simulated sexual activity or sexual jokes, a variety of different things. So hazing that's done in a sexual manner may not also be hazing. It may also have some Title IX implications. And if you think about the reasons we have moved towards a civil rights model with Title IX cases, it's largely done to protect the victim and to provide an equal playing field for the victim and to not subject the victim to re-victimization, retaliation, etc. If you compare hazing victims to sexual assault victims, in some ways they're a lot alike, right? I think about victim blaming, right? That victim blaming is a huge problem with sexual assault, also a big problem with hazing. And it's, oh, they voluntarily did that. They knew what they were getting into. They deserved it. No, they didn't. They didn't deserve to be humiliated. They didn't deserve to be beaten. They didn't deserve to be forced to drink to the point of nearly killing themselves. There's opportunities for retaliation. Again, a lot of sexual assault victims we know don't come forward because of that fear of retaliation. Same thing with hazing. They don't want to be a pariah within their organization, within their community, and there's so many stories of students who reported hazing who had to eventually transfer schools, go somewhere else because they became a pariah on campus. That sense of re-victimization, fear of having to sit in a hearing and confront the person who assaulted and or hazed you. So there's a lot of similarities between the victimology of sexual assault and the victimology of hazing. And so because of that, I think a civil rights process is a much more appropriate way to address, frankly, not only hazing, but any victim-based allegation or problem, not just Title IX related incidents. And if you're not familiar with that term of a civil rights process, basically what I'm talking about is that there's an independent investigation by a trained investigator, that person writes and submits a report to an administrator who makes a determination of whether or not the university's policy was violated. There's no hearing. There's no cross-examination. There's some limits for, in terms of appeals and that sort of thing, but it's not a courtroom scene. It's a civil rights type process. You're much more likely to get victims to come forward when they can tell their story to an unbiased investigator as opposed to getting cross-examined by the very people who are hazing them. So there's a number of reasons to move in that direction, and most campuses already have the framework for this in place. Most campuses are already training teams of investigators to investigate Title IX cases. Those same teams can very easily be trained to also adjudicate hazing cases. A half day of training, really understanding hazing, the psychology of it, and how to properly conduct an investigation. And you can train people to do these investigations. They are complex and they are difficult, but a trained university investigator is much more likely to reach the truth and to get hazing victims to open up than a more traditional student conduct process. So there's so many overlaps between hazing and Title IX that I think it just makes sense for campuses to move forward with a model where they adjudicate their hazing cases in much the same manner that they're now addressing and adjudicating their Title IX cases. I think that would be an important step forward for higher education if we moved in that direction.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of our time, and we want to be respectful of everyone who has other commitments. There's about a minute left in the webinar. So, Dr. McCurry, is there anything that you'd like to add, sort of parting to our participants?
Yeah, I think as we think about the things we need to do moving forward, one of the things I really think about is this idea of creative sanctioning that reduces the power differential. I love to ask the question of why hazing tends to be much more severe in fraternities than it is with sports teams, bands, other organizations. And to me, the reason is that with those other organizations, at the end of the day, there's a responsible adult who's in charge, right? So you think about hazing on a football team. You know, a senior can haze the freshman, but the freshman's only going to tolerate so much from that senior because at the end of the day, that senior really doesn't have any power over him. The coach does. And so if that freshman's better than the senior, he's going to get to play. And so he's not going to tolerate that much from the senior. And so I think we need to get creative about ways that we can address the power differential that's inherent in particularly the fraternity new member process. So, you know, sanctions that eliminate the traditional pledging program as we know it, or sanctions that create more alumni and responsible adult oversight, wherein decisions about new members aren't just made by members of the active chapter, but are made in conjunction with alumni. If I'm a fraternity pledge and I know that the guy who's hazing me won't have absolute power to remove me from the organization as simply as, you know, dropping a black ball into a box, then I'm probably a lot less likely to accept kind of severe and dangerous forms of hazing from him. And I think the other thing that we've got to do, in addition to better investigations, which I think we'll get if we move to a traditional, or from that traditional model to a civil rights model, is that we've got to rethink our educational approaches. You know, there's a lot of things that we're doing that I think are well-intentioned but just aren't working. I don't think that the bystander approach, bystander training has a lot of positives associated with sexual assault prevention, a lot of positives associated with, you know, alcohol poisoning and getting people help. There is no evidence to suggest, and actually a lot of evidence to suggest, that bystander training is not an effective hazing prevention strategy, because we're talking about in-group behavior. We're talking about behaviors that people see as beneficial to the group. And so before we can even begin talking about bystander behavior with hazing, we've got to first reprogram students into not believing the things that they've been taught to believe about hazing. The fact that hazing doesn't build commitment, it doesn't build long-term solidarity, it doesn't build brotherhood, it's not about tradition. There's all these myths that students have built up in their minds about all the good things that hazing accomplishes, but they're simply not true. And so before we can go forward with traditional approaches that often make the assumption that people believe that the behavior in question to be problematic, most students that are involved in organizations that haze do not perceive hazing to be problematic. They perceive it to be a good thing. So before we can move forward with traditional prevention models like hazing, like education, like increased enforcement, the first thing we have to do is do a better job convincing students that all the good things that they associate with hazing just aren't true, that hazing doesn't accomplish all of these things that we attribute it to. And so my writing and my research, and when I go to a campus and speak with or meet with students, that's the number one thing I try to do, to present to them an alternative dialogue that basically says all these things you've been told about hazing, all these things you've been taught to believe about hazing, they're not true, and here's why. And if you buy that, here's some things that you can start doing to fix that in your organization. So I think that's the most important thing we can do, and we've got to be smart about the way we do this. Hazing is a very unique issue, and it requires non-traditional and unique approaches.
That's fantastic, and unfortunately we're out of time. But I know that I've put up this last slide here because you're also on Twitter at Dr. Gentry, and encourage people to reach out to Dr. McCreary if they have any further questions. We'll be following up. We live tweeted the event. We'll be following up. We'll be posting or making the webinar available to people who are interested. Additionally, we'll try and get some of the resources and ideas that Dr. McCreary was mentioning. We'll put them up on our blog, or we'll tweet them. So we'll have some kind of follow-up to what the discussion here. And with that, I want to thank Dr. McCreary for his time. We really appreciate it. This was a fascinating conversation. I certainly learned a lot.
And I would certainly like to thank Pax as well. Did a great job moderating. And thank you also, Dr. McCreary. A lot of positive feedback on Twitter as well as in the chat box there. Everyone seemed to find your information on hazing extremely beneficial, and hopefully we'll take this back to our campuses. So that does conclude our webinar, how to address hazing culture on campus.